Hi guys, and welcome to the Finished Work Eschatology vlog series, vlog number 19, subtitling this week, Great Tribulation. I specifically don't call it the Great Tribulation, not because it wasn't a Great Tribulation, but because that phrase, the Great Tribulation, is so often referred to as a future prophetic event somewhere in our future timeline, and it's categorized usually by some 7-year period. You know all the ins and outs of that. I'm not going to deal with that with even countering or rebutting that argument in this vlog, because we did a vlog called last week called the 144,000. I'm sorry, a few weeks ago we did one called Daniel's 70th week, and in that vlog we dealt with that 7-year period. You probably didn't take long in our vlog to realize I don't believe in a future 7-year period called the Great Tribulation. I do, however, believe in Great Tribulation. I believe it fell within the timeline of the audience that Jesus was speaking to. Let's see that verse. Matthew chapter 24, verse 21. For then there will be great tribulation, such as has not been since the beginning of the world, until this time, no, nor ever shall be. And the first important thing is Jesus says, for then there will be great tribulation. He doesn't reference it as way out in the future, but that it will immediately follow the preceding events. So to understand the timing of Great Tribulation, one need go no further than read the first 20 verses of this chapter, specifically beginning in about verse 3 at the Olivet Discourse, where the disciples ask specific questions. Jesus is specifically answering that audience. So in order to really talk about Great Tribulation as it regards Matthew 24 and end-time events, let's talk about the events that led up to it. I'm not talking about events that will lead up to. I'm talking about events that led up to Great Tribulation as it happened in the time that Jesus said it would happen. First and foremost, it's important to note the timing that the Jews rebelled against Rome through a couple of different acts. One was the Zealots, who militarized a lot of Jews in Jerusalem and Judea. Many Jews were still waiting on their Messiah. They missed it in Jesus. And they wanted a Messiah that was militant. They wanted a Messiah that would overthrow Rome. And there's a plethora of false messiahs that rise up in the first century trying to lead some sort of army against the Roman rulers. And one of their first tactics was to stop paying their taxes. Nothing will get the attention of the government like people who refuse to pay their taxes. And in Jerusalem specifically, they tore down the cloisters, the coverings where between the soldiers' barracks and the temple. They tore those down in what they considered some sort of rebellion, spiritual rebellion against Rome attaching itself to the temple. So now they were damaging Roman property, they were abusing Roman soldiers, and they were refusing to pay their taxes. So Rome, of course, comes in to take care of the issue. I want to read some things today from Josephus. A lot of people asked for me to give the sources so they can either go buy these books on their own and do some studying. Reading from a 1979 reprint published by Baker Bookhouse called The Works of Josephus, Volume 1, The War of the Jews. What I do is give you page numbers from that volume, so if you want to go and find it. Let me read to you something that Josephus said that, and remember, King Agrippa, whom Paul deals with in the book of Acts, is the Roman appointed king in Judea at the time of this first century. And King Agrippa calls the multitude of zealots and those who are rebellious in Jerusalem together in the large galleries there in Jerusalem and warns them against fighting against Rome. And here's what Josephus records on page 185 of the War of the Jews. This is what Agrippa says to the crowd. But certainly no one can imagine that you can enter into a war as by an agreement, or that when the Romans have got you under their power, they will use you with moderation, or will not rather, for an example to other nations, burn your holy city and utterly destroy your whole nation. For those of you who shall survive the war will not be able to find a place wherein to flee, since all men have the Romans for their lords already, or are afraid they shall have hereafter. Nay, indeed, the danger concerns not those Jews that dwell here only, but those of them who dwell in other cities also. For there is no people upon the habitable earth which have not some portion of you among them, whom your enemies will slay in case you go to war. And on that account also, and so every city which has Jews in it will be filled with slaughter for the sake of only a few men. This is King Agrippa talking to the Jews in Jerusalem, warning them that it would be futile. Well, they revolt, and the revolt begins around AD 65, and by October of AD 66, Rome sends troops under Cestius Gaius, and the Jews seem to turn the tide. They actually caused Cestius Gaius and his troops to fall back from Jerusalem in early or late AD 66, which causes Emperor Nero to send General Vespasian. Now, Vespasian, if you know your Roman history, will actually go on to be the emperor of Rome. And Vespasian comes to crush the rebellion. He begins this in February of AD 67. We have an amazingly accurate account of these events due to eyewitness testimony. By August of AD 70, about 3 years later, the general is standing in the temple in Jerusalem, and by September, the entire city falls by September of AD 70. Notice the time frame on that. Let me repeat those dates. Vespasian is sent by Nero to attack and destroy the area of Judea, and then namely Jerusalem, in AD 67. Jerusalem is well fortified, and it holds off for quite some time until August of AD 70, when Jerusalem falls. Approximately 42 months between the attack on Judea and the fall of the Jewish temple. Listen to Revelation chapter 11, verses 1 and 2. Then I was given a reed like a measuring rod, and the angel stood saying, Rise and measure the temple of God, the altar, and those who worship there. First of all, this is important to me, that if Revelation is written after AD 70, John doesn't even hesitate. The temple would have been gone. John would have known that. But he doesn't even hesitate when he sees the angel measuring the temple. If this were after AD 70, surely he thinks, why is there a temple in Jerusalem when there is no temple in Jerusalem? But he doesn't. To me, it's an internal proof that Revelation is written prior to the fall of that temple. Listen to verse 2. But leave out the court which is outside the temple, and don't measure it, for it has been given to the Gentiles, and they will tread the holy city underfoot for 42 months. Revelation 11 actually prophesies that Jerusalem will be trampled underfoot by Gentiles for 42 months. From the time General Vespasian arrives in the Holy Land, Judea, until the fall of the temple in AD 70, was 42 months between those two periods. I'm sorry, I don't think it's a coincidence. And I think the audience that was warned would not have thought it was a coincidence either. Let me read to you some more Josephus, some amazing, amazing things that Josephus records. Namely, let me show you a few of the death tolls. I don't want to get morbid and go overboard on these numbers, but I always wished someone would share some of this stuff with me historically, and I want to make sure that you're given the opportunity to see some of these things for yourself. Let me just read off a few. By AD 67, Vespasian shows up in Jerusalem with 60,000 Roman troops. He goes in, and as they go through the villages, he starts in Gadara. He kills all the youth. The Romans have no mercy on any age whatsoever, Josephus says. They move on to the village of Jotapata, and then Japaha. They kill 15,000. They take 2,130 prisoners. They go to Mount Gerizim and kill 11,600. They go to Tarakai and kill 6,500. They go to Gamala and kill 4,000. And 5,000 people commit suicide, throwing themselves over the walls to avoid the Roman troops. And then they go to Gishgala and they kill 6,000 women and children, while most of the men flee to Jerusalem. Josephus records all of this on his Wars of the Jews, pages 291 and 292. He says Vespasian and Titus took other cities, and there were disorders and civil wars in every city. Pretty remarkable. Listen to this. Josephus records that it looked as if God doomed Jerusalem to destruction. This is from the War of the Jews, page 314. God doomed Jerusalem to destruction as a polluted city and was resolved to purge his sanctuary by fire. Literally, Josephus is not a Christian writer. He's a Jewish writer, and sees that it appears that the destruction is so overwhelming that it appears to be God-forsaken. Titus camps out against Jerusalem in April of AD 70, and his siege lasts from April into August, when he finally goes in and stands in the temple, and he finally levels Jerusalem by September. Listen, looking back, it seems to become obvious to me of what we're dealing with here. But if you had been alive during that day, in that time period, I don't think, if you knew of the writings of Matthew and his gospel, and you knew the words of Jesus, I don't think there's any way that you were there that day at the Olivet Discourse when Jesus said these things would happen. If you saw this happening in AD 67 through AD 70, there's no way you would have thought Matthew 24 was still out in your future. Not to see the widespread slaughter that was going on. Josephus records that Titus, when he arrives in April of AD 70, between April and August, and he goes in to take the city, he over and over and over urges the inhabitants of Jerusalem to surrender, but they refuse. I've wondered, do they refuse because they think God will save them? And if they did, they had again ignored the words of Jesus, that this was indeed the days of vengeance and the wrath of God. Josephus says this on page 404 of his writing. Neither did any other city ever suffer such miseries, nor did any age ever breed a generation more fruitful in wickedness than this was from the beginning of the world. He then says this. Listen, this is incredible. He says this on page 405 of his book, The Works of Josephus, Volume 1, The Wars of the Jews. They were first whipped, then tormented with all sorts of this is what happens to the inhabitants of Jerusalem once the Romans get inside. First whipped, then tormented with all sorts of tortures before they died, and were then crucified before the wall of the city. This miserable procedure made Titus greatly to pity them, while they caught every day 500 Jews. Nay, some days they caught more. So the soldiers, out of the wrath and hatred they bore the Jews, nailed those they caught, one after one way, and another after another, to the crosses by way of jest, when their multitude was so great that room was wanting for the crosses, and crosses wanting for the bodies. 500 a day during the siege of Jerusalem were crucified outside of the walls of Jerusalem. I'm making this point, I'm overwhelmingly making this point, because I want to show you that the tribulation that they were in was indeed great and unlike anything the world had ever seen. He was crucifying 500 people a day. This is a confirmation of what Jesus says. Let's read from Luke 19, verses 43 and 44. For days will come upon you when your enemies will build an embankment around you, surround you, and close you in on every side, and level you and your children within you to the ground, and they will not leave in you one stone upon another, because you did not know the time of your visitation. And the time of their visitation was the time when Jesus visited and came for the lost sheep of the house of Israel. On July the 17th, AD 70, the final morning and afternoon sacrifice was offered by the high priest in the temple in Jerusalem, July 17th, AD 70, and never again would the daily sacrifice be offered, because within a month Titus was standing in the holy place, and within 2 months Jerusalem was completely destroyed. Cannibalism ran rampant. Suicide ran rampant. I want to read one more prophecy to you from the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 28. This is way back in the Torah. And God prophesies what would happen if his people rejected. Listen, Deuteronomy chapter 28, verse 53. I'll read 52 and 53. They will besiege you at your gates until your high and fortified walls in which you trust come down throughout your land. And they shall besiege you at all your gates throughout all your land which the Lord your God has given you. You shall eat the fruit of your own body, the flesh of your sons and your daughters, whom the Lord your God has given you, in the siege and desperate straits in which your enemy shall distress you. This is Deuteronomy 28. Israel had heard this prophecy for a long, long time. Listen, a lot of people will hear the argument. Great tribulation happened to Israel in AD 67 to AD 70, and they'll say, you mean to tell me you think it was greater than the Holocaust, where 6 million Jews died? And I don't want to in any way insinuate that the Holocaust was not a terrible event. You'd be foolish to say that. But I will say that I believe that the events that happened in Jerusalem and Judea between AD 67 and AD 70, as it pertains to the religion the Jews knew, was the biggest and greatest tribulation that would ever befall the Jewish nation. They lost their temple. They lost their priesthood. They lost their genealogical records. They lost their sacrificial system. In effect, they lost every single thing they could identify themselves by. All that was left was ceremony, processes like circumcision and observing days, none of which even gave them redemption anyhow. And they had lost it all. So yes, great tribulation. Adam Clarke's commentary records 1.3 million Jews were killed by the invading Roman troops between AD 67 and AD 70. 1.3 million. Can you imagine the population of the earth couldn't have been more than 4 or 5, if that? And that means an enormous amount of the people that were alive in that day died. Over 100,000 prisoners were taken. I want to just real quickly as I close show you the Bible's use of hyperbole. A lot of Bible students don't recognize hyperbole. It's a form of exaggerated expression that was understood and used by the Hebrew people all throughout their writings. It indicates the greatness or the vastness of something. And so while Jesus says not one stone shall be left unturned, Titus did actually leave some walls standing. That's why there's the Wailing Wall in Jerusalem right now. It was left. The Romans didn't knock it over. But before you think, well, see, that proves that it didn't occur that way, Jesus says in Matthew 24:21, such as was not since the beginning of the world to this time, nor ever shall be, but the Bible's full of hyperbole. Listen to this, Exodus 10:14. Before them there were no such locusts as they, neither after them shall there be such. Exodus 11:6. There shall be a great cry throughout the land of Egypt, such as there was none like it, nor shall be like it any more. 2 Kings 3:12 says of King Solomon, there was no one like you before you, neither after you shall any rise like you. And yet Jesus says in Matthew 12:42, a greater than Solomon is here. Is the Bible contradicting itself? No. The Hebrews loved hyperbole. 2 Kings 18:5 says of Hezekiah, so after him there was none like him among all the kings of Judah, nor any that were before him. 2 Kings 23 says of Josiah, like him there was no king before him, neither after him rose there any king like him. 5 chapters earlier, God said the same thing about Hezekiah. It's not that the Bible is contradicting itself. It's using hyperbole to describe and exaggerate a real event, a real thing, to try to get you to understand it. Listen to Ezekiel 5:9 concerning Jerusalem. I will do in you that which I have not done, and whereunto I will not do any more the like because of all your abominations. But this is the same thing Jesus said will happen to Jerusalem in his generation. It goes on, and my thanks to evangelist John L. Bray in his book Matthew 24 Fulfilled for putting some of those hyperbole statements from the Hebrew writings into one accessible spot. All right. I'm about out of time. I don't want to, as they say, beat a dead horse. I don't want to go over and over and over that thought. I just want you to see that it was within the timeline of Jesus. Some would ask, what's the point? How does this make Jesus look good? What I would say to that is, it defends the Jesus of the Bible against those who attack him by saying he thought he was living in the last days, but he wasn't. He thought that they were in the end times, but they weren't. And if he was wrong, how can you trust him on anything? I would agree with that statement. If he was wrong, how could you trust him on anything? I don't think he was wrong. I think we're wrong in how we interpret him. I think he was right. I think he was speaking to them about events in their generation. We'll go on to verse 22 next week. I hope you have a great week. God bless you.